where she's discovered this thing about the world, which is that as dragon populations are being eradicated, the ecosystems around them are suffering. And this happens in our world too. If you remove apex predators, things kind of start falling apart. And so there's famines and shortages of food and kind of strange things happening in the environment. But nobody else knows or cares about this. She finds herself as the only conservationist like in the entire world. So she's put in this position where she's both trying to save the dragons, which no one else is interested in doing, and she's also found this kind of mysterious power inside the bodies of them that she's working to explore in the first book. So they both have these journeys they have to go through, and it's always hard to talk about a sequel without spoiling too much. But in Sorcery of a Queen, I think it's fair to say that, you know, by the end of Blood of an Exile, the main characters have had some successes and also some pretty big failures. And even their successes have led to some very unintended consequences that they now have to sort through in the second one. And so, you know, the world kind of expands. We get to see some new places that didn't come up in the first book. There's this very bizarre island full of, you know, kind of mushroom creatures and zombies. And then at the same time, we get to dig deeper into some cities and places that only really appeared in a few chapters in the first one. So that's pretty much the quick and dirty of Blood of an Exile and Sorcerer of a Queen. And there's, yeah, lots of action, lots of humor, some serious bits. There's a part that I cry at every time I was trying to do my edits and I missed typos because I was so upset with what I'd done to my own characters. But you know, generally speaking, it's, you know, fast-paced and fun fantasy. It's my stuff.
Thanks, Brian. And Lavie, do you want to talk about By Force Alone? Oh, hold on, you're muted.
Hi, good call on muting me. So again, just to apologize to anyone tuning in, I explained to the other panelists, I got the dates completely wrong and I'm currently in London on the Thames, right by St. Paul's Cathedral. But that explains why people are coming and going and my face might be going. There's a lot of masks and hand gels and things going on in the background. How do I think my writing generally comes from the opposite direction to the other two. It doesn't come from love of something so much as a hate of something. In this particular case, I was forced, for no reason of my own, to learn about the Arthurian mythos. Partly because basically I'm a full-time writer, but occasionally my old university drags me in to teach undergraduates, which is American undergraduates specifically, who are very sweet, but terrifying. And I ended up having to engage with the Arthurian stories without knowing anything about them. Partly because the guy who set this up is a medievalist. You know, he kind of teaches the Green Knight and the symbolism of the colors in the Green Knight. And I was like, I don't know what the Green Knight is. I understand it's an Anglo-Saxon poem that is not very important in my life. I don't really like King Arthur a great deal. So I ended up by researching it, thinking, well, there's something interesting here. And what happened when I read through it, when I really started to familiarize myself with the original sources and so on, is that the story is there the way we're told that the story goes, which is Arthur is a noble king and he pulls a sword from the stone and he becomes this great king. And it's, you know, if you actually read the story, it makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, he's basically some urchin who has to fight all the other kings and kill them so he can become king. And then someone younger and more ruthless comes along and kills him. And then the Anglo-Saxons invade anyway and pretty much destroy everything he's built. And I thought that is pretty much the structure of every great gangster film ever made, you know, from The Godfather, Goodfellas, so on. And I thought, firstly, someone must have done this because it's so obvious. And I looked it up, and everyone's doing the chivalry bit. They're doing, this is great, that he's the king, and and I don't know what's so great about being a king. And so once I kind of realized that angle and thought no one has done this in 1,000 years of Arthurian fiction, I thought, well, maybe that would be an interesting thing to write. The mistake I made was partly selling it to my British publishers. They kind of said, you know, this would be great if you did like 4 books about the entire British mythology. So I'm now kind of committed to a 4-volume, and Sarah, I really liked your 4-volume thing, so I'd like to do a 4-volume thing, moving gradually through British mythology. So I call it the antimatter of Britain. It's everything you love about the matter of Britain destroyed.
Do you have the Holy Grail in there?
I've got the Holy Grail, but it's very much not the Holy Grail. But it's very loyal to the original Holy Grail. But the original Holy Grail was a star stone that fell from the sky. And before that, it was a saucer of blood. And only then that it's become the Holy Grail we know.
Okay.
And so I couldn't resist putting all 3 versions in there. So I think people who like swords would like it, because I don't care for swords very much. So I literally have a sword scene that goes / hack hack stab, and that's the big scene of the book. That's the big fight. So, and there's possibly an alien spaceship. And some kung fu. So it's only a traditional Arthurian book, but it was fun. It was a lot of fun to write, put it this way. And that's out now. So.
Do you have Merlin in your books? What's Merlin's deal in your take of it?
Merlin's an interesting character, because we're used to Merlin being Gandalf, right, or Dumbledore.
Yeah.
And if you go back to the original sources, Merlin's a kid. He's literally a kid who gets bullied by the other kid because his mum is a succubus, or his dad. You know, one of his parents isn't mortal; is a fae. And so the kids kind of beat up on him until the original king, Vortigern, grabs him and kind of uses him as his wizard boy, essentially. Now, when Arthur first meets Merlin, he doesn't believe he's a wizard, because he's like, look, you're a kid, you haven't even got like stubble on you. So Merlin literally, in the original story, Merlin goes away, comes back as an old man with a big beard. He basically puts on the Dumbledore, and Arthur goes, oh, okay, you're clearly a wizard, because you've got a big beard. And that's where we get the whole big beard old man wizard out of. But my Merlin is pretty much a young, semi-human, kind of ruthless. But he was fun to write, basically. But he's not exactly the Merlin. He's not Dumbledore.
Gotcha.
For one thing, he has a lot more sex than Dumbledore does.
Well, and that's one of the interesting things, is how magic is handled differently in fantasy novels. So Brian, in your book, there's less magic and more technology that they just don't understand yet, that they think of as magic, which I always think is fun. How do you guys go about deciding how you're going to handle the sort of magical, whether they're considered magic or not, properties in your books?
Yeah, I can kind of talk about my magic system or lack thereof, as you said. Yeah, sort of exactly right. I didn't originally intend to have it that way, but most of the fantastical elements is really just sort of science, and it's poorly understood. And for me, so I guess it's not even really a hard magic system or a soft magic system, but the one thing that I tried to stick to as I was writing it, and I sort of realized this after the fact, was that in so much as there are kind of magic or fantastical elements in my story, because there is stuff, you know, the Dragon Slayer described him as Wolverine, as the Dragon Slayer, so he can, you know, he's more resilient to injuries than any man in our kind of world would be, and all of that. And there's some things that could be construed as lightning magic and that kind of thing. But anyway, whenever I wanted to do something like that, because I'd introduced this one big element, this big fantasy element of dragons into the story, any other kind of supernatural stuff I wanted to do, even if it was going to have a scientific explanation, I wanted it to be rooted back to dragons in some way or another. So that was kind of my like rule that I made for myself, which has caused me some heartache over the writing process, but by and large has been really fun. So that was kind of the approach I took. I gave myself one little door that I could open, and I could pull all sorts of crazy stuff out of it, as long as I could think of a kind of a realistic reason that would be there. So that was my approach for it.
A little bit like what Lavie was saying, I wrote magic sort of in opposition to a lot of the magic I had been reading in fantasy books. In a lot of fantasy books, magic will do everything, right? It's a deus ex machina. And always, always, when you perform your magic, you get a headache or you faint and you fall down, right? It takes your soul out of you to do this terrible magic. And I hated both those things. So I needed some grace notes of magical elements, but I wanted them to be very small. So like Brian, I created limits. The spirits, I'm really talking about climate change, and I'm talking about weather. I'm talking about the sea, I'm talking about fresh water, fire. And then a few people have an inborn talent. It doesn't make them Gandalf, doesn't make them Merlin. They're just really good at one thing. And one thing I hope readers realize as they go along is that, yes, the queens have a magical talent, but every character in the series discovers their own skill, their own expertise that they didn't really know was there until it was called upon. So I just kept squishing the magic down to make it as small as possible. So you never see the gods or spirits. There are these people called agents, and I really thought of them as real estate agents. They act for the gods in their place, but they have no magic power of their own. So, yeah. What about you, Lavie?
I like the idea of agents, actually.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I'm going to steal that. That's okay.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think the magic, don't get me wrong, I love rigorous magic systems. I'm a huge Tim Powers fan, and, reading his last book, and there's this whole chase scene where they're tracking this FBI agent using a bloodied sock, and at some point someone shouts, "Get the sock!" because they need to, they need the sock to chase, and it makes perfect sense within the context. He's brilliant at it. But I think because I've lived in societies that still have magic around them, that magic is still part of the culture, and it's very matter of fact. You would talk to someone and they would say, "Yeah, my uncle is a shapeshifter." He changes into a dog or a wolf sometimes, and then he comes back, and it's really not a big deal. It's very a part of it, and I think that I tried to kind of echo that. So the book does have a lot of, and then she turned into a fish and swam away. It's very matter of factly, people just turn into fish or birds and all that, and it's very natural magic, which again is the magic of stones, the magic of I think original magic really does go back to stones. Stones are very important in that regard. But so I didn't have any very strict rules. I think one theme through the book, especially for Merlin, because I have Merlin as someone who's clearly a fantasy creature, but he's obsessed with science and mathematics. And he hates that he's a fantasy creature. He hates this whole part of himself. And he has to get through fairyland at some point, because I got very interested in this whole British notion of fairyland. And the only way he can get through is every time the monsters attack him, which I think, again, I stole from Tim Powers, but he starts muttering prime numbers or something to get rid of them. It makes them less real. And his great tragedy is that he's a magical creature who really would just like to have a functioning microwave oven. But other than that, yeah, there's a dragon somewhere, and then people just turn into fish or birds and fly away, and it works. And it's interesting living in that sort of environment as well when that is the case.
I really wish I'd created a world where people could just turn into fish and swim away. That seems very freeing, because because I wanted to title myself science, if I want to do something weird, I need like an explanation for it. So I have to get on Wikipedia. And like in the third book that I'm writing right now, I get into sort of magnetic stuff and magnetism and orientations and that sort of thing. So I have to sit there on Wikipedia reading about all those things for like 5 hours before I can go do, or I do the cool thing and then I have to go back and think of a way that that was plausible. But it'd be way cooler if my characters could just turn into fish and jump into the river. I dig that.
I could never write science fiction because I really don't understand black holes or all that, you know? I mean, there's all that stuff about not having air and vacuums and velocity and no, just stones, fire, rain. I can deal with that. Horses.
Yeah, I don't think my stuff holds up to real world science all the way through like the hard sci-fi book. I have a friend, and I was kind of going around in circles with this magnetism thing. I have a friend who's kind of like I don't know what kind of scientist. He's like a space scientist. He makes stuff for satellites and that kind of thing. And so I like showed him. It's like, this is how it would generally work. And he's like, yeah, all of that's completely wrong, but sounds cool.
I mean, the thing is, no one understands black holes, which is the whole beauty of black holes. I love writing science fiction, but fantasy is much easier. The hard bit for me was doing quite detailed historical stuff about a period that doesn't have much historical stuff in it. Yeah. And you do get it at some point where I'm very historically accurate to Anglo-Saxon burial rituals or whatever it was. And I have them crossing the river at some point. And then I said, you know what, from this point on, it's just the fantasy stuff. There's a dragon, there's going to be mutants. Because it's a fantasy, I can still do that. I've done the historical stuff. I've been accurate as accurate can be. Now let's make it weird. Let's get freaky.
I remember clearly early on I had a conversation with my editor because going back to Brian talking about swords, I didn't know the difference between a pike and a lance. And my editor said, Sarah, this will not do. You have to do your homework. And I said, oh, okay. Well, no, first I said, what does it matter? It's fantasy. And she said, it matters. People will, read your book, and if you've got these things confused, they'll throw it away. So then I went in the opposite direction, and I did all of this research. And not only did I do all of this research, but because, do I understand battle strategy? No. So I found a colonel at West Point who became my battle strategy expert, and I sent him all of my fighting scenes for his approval. And he's the one who said that Thalen should have a rapier. So if you have any problem with Thalen carrying a rapier, you go to my lieutenant colonel. I don't want to hear about it.
He's in the acknowledgement, so everyone knows who to go.
Yes, everybody can find it.
So you all do a lot of research. Is there ever anything you find in research that you weren't originally planning on putting into your books, but once you've read about it, you're so fascinated by it, you have to?
I'm trying to think. The one that jumps out to me, and for my stuff, it's very based in a lot of the research that I did and stuff I incorporated because I really like reading about animals on the internet and like watching documentaries about animals. So I figured that's one of the reasons I threw dragons in there, because I wanted to be able to, make this amalgamation of different animal facts I'd read about on the internet. And so I was reading about electric eels and how they kind of create the currents with, they have this special gland, and they have, it reacts with sodium, and I'm gonna not get into the details because I'll butcher it, but I do remember reading that, and I was kind of just wasting time at work at my day job at the time, but I was sort of halfway through Blood of an Exile, and I was like, well, maybe I'll make a dragon that has that gland in their body, and they can kind of generate electricity, and then you've got an electrical dragon. So that was one that I remember. I think I was still at work when I started making my dragon with electrical powers and sort of pretending that I was doing real work when I was just taking animal facts off of the internet. So yeah, I think that was one. There's probably 100 more because I do that to kind of procrastinate and waste time quite a bit. Just get on Wikipedia or Reddit and look up things.
I can't think of an example for this, but for the book I'm working on now, I had to do original research that isn't in any, I mean, it isn't in any of my film textbooks. It was about some ways in which film was used in World War II, which was just mentioned in the history books and whatever, but there was no concrete description and no, I went down to the National Archive in Washington. I got the station lists of who was at which army camp and at which battle. I mean, that was fun. That was fun. But that's a whole different book.
Yeah, I mean, it's always fun to talk about the book we're doing now and how much research.
Right, because these are old, right? I mean, we wrote these a while ago.
I'm trying not to. I'll tell you what, my favorite thing that happened with writing this book is I had the idea that I wanted one section written from the point of view of a cat. For some reason. You know, a bit like the cats, what were those cat mystery books, you know, when the cat solves crimes. I just wanted a cat. It doesn't matter. And I said, I wish there was a cat in the Arthurian legends. And a friend of mine is very into this sort of stuff. There is a cat. Her name is Cat Palug, and she's a monstrous fish cat who kills people. And it is. Look it up. It's all over the Arthurian myth. And I was like, fantastic. So I have this entire section narrated by a murderous fish cat, and I can put hand on heart and say this is 100% accurate. You know, this is research. This isn't just because I wanted a cat.
That's awesome.
And I love cat bulldog.
We all have animals, actually. The queen's talent is that she can talk to animals. So there's a through thread between these three books of the role of animals.
Yeah, no, I love animals. Although I will say we have a newly adopted set of 3 backyard chickens, which they have been croaking. I don't know if anyone can hear them, but we're getting used to our lives as backyard chicken parents. I'm not sure that I love the chickens as much as I love, you know, the dogs that I have or have had in my life. But I only brought that up because they ran into our neighbor's yard, or they hopped over the fence yesterday. So I was scrambling to pick up chickens, which is surprisingly difficult. And our friend who we took them from, he just sort of like snatched them and he made it look really easy. And so I thought it wasn't going to be a problem, and it's a lot harder. Or I suck at grabbing chickens, just as a personal failure for myself.
I just got a puppy. I didn't think I would make it through the pandemic winter without something. And when you start with an 8-week-old puppy who's just, you know, nipping, and yeah, it's not as hard as grabbing chickens, but there's some challenge in there.
Oh, I can imagine. And I think that the nice part about puppies, though, is that they snuggle with you and they're sweet and they love you. But my chickens don't love me. I wouldn't say that they like me particularly, and I'm not sure that they ever will.
And they carry salmonella, so don't kiss them.
Yeah, it's a process. I don't know if I'm a permanent chicken parent. I'm gonna, you know, take care of them. They needed a place to stay, but we'll see how this goes. Check on me in a couple months. We'll see if I still have chickens.
I'd say that was one of the only fights I got into. Basically, I ended up living on an island in the South Pacific for a year. And the one big fight I got into was with my neighbor over his chickens. Who used to wake me up in the morning. I lived in a bamboo hut on this island, this volcanic island. And his chicken would start waking me up at 6 in the morning. And, you know, everyone carries these big bush knives, big machetes. And I had long hair at that point, I should point out. So I kind of staggered out with my 40-inch blade and my hair going down. I followed this chicken across this field.
Stab.
And I got to my neighbor and I just said, look, if your chicken he didn't take me very seriously. I said, if your chicken comes to my house again, I'm going to kill your chicken. And he said, if you kill my chicken, I'm going to take you to court. And I was like, you take me to court. You take me to court. I'm going to kill your chicken. So I did not kill the chicken. All the animals are fine. Have not been harmed in the creation of this book.
No, chickens were hard in the creation.
I
But
understand.
yeah, not a big fan of chickens.
Yeah, I understand that early morning rage, and I wake up early anyway, but I still, you know, and I do own a sword because I'm a nerd, and so I have a sword, and I'm not going to use it, but in the back of my mind, a couple times, I'm like, maybe I should just use the sword on the chicken, and then this problem gets solved real fast. You know, not going to do it, but you live out the scene and how it would go, and how much better and quieter your life would be, you know, pretty far along before you then abandon that idea.
Well, Sarah, we know they're chicken killing weapons of choice. If you had to kill a chicken, what weapon do you think you would use?
We really are going, well, recently, this is gross, and I'm really pretty anti-violence, but I've been thinking a lot about baseball bats, you know, that people buy guns thinking that their guns are going to protect them, and then they shoot the wrong people, or they shoot themselves, the gun misfires. A baseball bat is really a very good weapon. You get a good grip on it. There's all that weight on the head of it. Yeah, I would just smash that sucker.
It's a chicken that had it coming, you know, the chicken, you know, potentially an evil chicken, something like that, where, you know, engage your core fully, give it a good swing. You know?
Gangster films, that chicken is going to sleep with the fishes. I mean.
Okay, so you are all fantasy authors. What is it that drew you to fantasy specifically?
I can go. For me, so I was an English major in college, and I was writing a lot of like literary fiction short stories, because that's it's what you're assigned to read, and it's often like what you wind up then writing. And it wasn't so much that fantasy was like poo-pooed on or anything like that. It just didn't come up. You read a Raymond Carver story, and then you wrote a story about Raymond that was sort of like, you know, mimicking Raymond Carver. And I love Raymond Carver, but I wasn't so great at mimicking him. So I would do these things where there was no real plot, no real action. It was just like an internal argument in someone's head, and that was the whole story. So I liked writing, but I didn't really like the type of stories that I was writing. So when I graduated, I realized that, you know, I wasn't getting graded anymore, and no one was even going to read the story unless I like forced them to. So I decided to write a story about a guy with a hangover who had to go kill a dragon. And that was without any like real plan to do anything beyond that. It was like a day or two after I graduated, and I had a hangover, so I was sort of, you know, putting myself in the story. And but those first few pages are still pretty much the first few pages of Blood of an Exile. And I didn't write it directly after college. I sort of just wandered around New York City for a few years, and eventually found, you know, a career, and I was living out in Colorado again. And then yeah, I had this massive like bus commute thing. And so I picked it up again, you know, a few years later. So yeah, it was more just, I always thought dragons were cool and kind of the spur of a moment thing. And then after, sort of between that little, you know, hungover writing session and when I started writing the book, I started reading a whole lot more fantasy. And my original thought in my head when I was like 22 was that I'd write this like, you know, gritty thing that's realistic, and I'll reinvent fantasy, and like didn't know that people had been doing that for like 30 years. I was not at all being unique or inventive or special. So yeah, that was kind of my way, and I sort of stumbled into it on a whim, and then, you know, got into you know, adult fantasy a little bit later after I started kind of writing this thing.
I'd always just loved fantasy. I mean, my heart was there. From when you start as a child, you know, it's Alice in Wonderland and it's Charlotte's Web. I mean, so many children's books are fantasy. And even though, yes, I was an English major, and yes, I've read Middlemarch and Jane Austen and all the great, and Tolstoy, all the great realists, if you ask me what just makes my heart soar, it's fantasy. So it's the I don't know. it's the scale and the grandeur of it. And so I was reading Robin Hobb, and I've read Robert Jordan, and then when I started to write, it was for that exact purpose, to write my answer to Lord of the Rings. So it wasn't like I was going to sit down and write my answer to Middlemarch. Lavie?
I'd like to see the answer to Middlemarch. And obviously Jane Austen fantasies are doing very well.
That's true. That's true.
That's definitely. No, I mean, I don't see myself as a fantasy guy, I suppose. I really come from science fiction, but and I'm one of those people who think there isn't really any difference between science fiction and fantasy, which of course science fiction fans would never forgive you for saying. And it's weird because I get to occasionally be a science fiction writer, and I've got an invitation to CERN next year to go around the super accelerator and so on, which is amazingly cool.
Yeah, that's really cool.
That's something you get to do as a science fiction writer.
Right.
But at the same time, it's not like you know any more about science. Really, there's not much difference between that and dragons and black holes. It's kind of the same thing. But when you're a science fiction writer, occasionally you'll have like startups in Silicon Valley saying, we want to create this vision, or people kind of take you seriously for talking about the future in science.
Futurist, right?
Yeah, futurist. I get. I have a friend who's an actual futurist, and they make much more money than we do. They get corporate rates to talk about the future. But I guess that's kind of it. It's still kind of, I'm a bit confused, and I've done these fantasy works. They're clearly fantasy. I've got these fantasy awards to my name, but I think inside I still think of myself as a nerdy science fiction guy. But By Force Alone does have a crashed spaceship in it. Spoilers. So, I can't help but put a little bit. If you can put a few aliens in, you can't go wrong.
I think it's always a good idea if you got the chance to put some aliens in. You should take it. Yeah.
And a dragon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are you all working on now? If you can talk about it. I know sometimes contracts don't allow you to talk about what you're working on now.
I can talk about mine because mine's easy, and I'm working on it with a purpose because my deadline is approaching. So the third book, so Dragons of Terra series is the trilogy, and the third book is going to be called Fury of the Demon, and that is what I'm heads down on. If my editor's watching, it's going great. I actually owe him a few pages that I'm going to get together for him after the call. So yeah, that's all I'm doing now. And then there'll be the wide open expanse of what's next later, but I can at least put that existential crisis off for a few more weeks here.
And I'm working on, I'm not going back to the Nine Realms immediately. I might someday. Do you guys, have you get these emails, people saying, when are you writing more? Yeah. So I'm writing a book about the 20th century and movie theaters and movies, because they say you're supposed to write what you know. So I pretended to know about kings and queens and horses and pikes and lances and battles, but dogs. And now I'm actually writing about something that I do know well and don't have to look up on Wikipedia.
Is there any like film stuff you were able to incorporate in your series?
I'm probably gonna have to write a blog and just reveal it all, because I thought I was sending people kind of on a scavenger hunt, and they would send little answers back to me. Oh, you stole that name from the Seven Samurai. Oh, that's a scene from To Kill a Mockingbird. Oh, I recognize that line from Johnny Guitar. Nobody has recognized anything.
Oh, no.
I'm just going to have to tell them all. And I don't know. So I think that all the film references were kind of maybe just my private game. Although there are some climactic scenes which I wrote as montage that people do realize are montage and realize, you know, the perspective is changing rapidly and this is frantic cuts. So people notice the style, but they don't notice the references.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You're still muted, Lavie.
Oh dear.
Lavie, you gotta unmute. We can't hear you.
I'm saying there's always people who pick up on, there's too many references in my books, and people always pick up on a few references and lose 99% of the references.
Oh, so that's common?
Yeah, but they pick on some. But I think film has a huge influence on literature and vice versa in the 20th century. And there hasn't really been much academic study of the way film and literature influence each other. And for me, writing by force alone, there's a section in the middle of By Force Alone called Bringing Up Bodies. And which is basically where Arthur starts killing off the rest of the competition. And what I wanted to go for was the scene in Goodfellas when they start playing Cream, you know, and his eyes, it's just his eyes, he looks at the guy and you know he's going to kill him, and then it starts and people start getting bumped off, you know, and it's this wonderful montage. And I was like, how the hell do you write that in book form? How do you take this cinematic masterpiece moment and write in a book form? And I think that was probably one of my proudest things, that I felt like I got it somehow. That I was basically just a scene where you're killing off a bunch of people.
Yeah.
But you're trying to make it artistic. You're trying to make them happy about getting bumped off. So that was kind of fun. But the question was about what we're working on, right? I'm kind of in this funny position where I have too much stuff coming out, and it's coming out on both sides of the Atlantic and not necessarily at the same time. So I think next year in the UK, we're going to get the unofficial follow-up to By Force Alone, which is called The Hood, which is my take on the Robin Hood myth. But it's not, as far as I know, going to be out in the US. So makes it a bit odd. But at the same time, in the US, I'm going to have a book called The Escapement, which is not going to be out in the UK. And that's one of my favorite books. And it's sort of like a surrealist fantasy. The publishers are kind of calling it, I think they're going with something like The Gunslinger meets the Phantom Tollbooth. Which is not inaccurate. I call it a clown western, but people don't like clowns, as it turns out. They really hate clowns
generally.
But it's one of my favorite books. So those are the things that are sort of coming out. I've also got this anthology of The Best of War, the SF, coming out next year, which is a giant sort of international science fiction anthology. But at the moment, I'm working on this huge historical crime saga, basically. So the research is I'm actually having to do the sort of research where you talk to, you know, crime reporters from the 80s and that sort of stuff. And I hate research. I hate talking to people. So it's pretty much my idea of a nightmare. A lot of what music did people listen to in 1974 in Israel, you know? As it turns out, they listen to some really sexist music, which is great for me, you know, great for the book. So, yeah.
I did, just to go back to the film thing we were talking about, it seems like all three of us do this. We're all definitely pull, like, it's more like the structure of scenes from movies, and I feel like that can work really well, especially if I'm like stuck on something or sort of lost. And I'm like a big believer that there are, you know, new and exciting stories, but there aren't like new story structures and story like, you know, like the bones of it or whatever you want to call it. And I feel like, yeah, somehow more than looking at like the way a scene unfolds in the book, that I like, it's way easier to be like, oh, this is like a worse version of that scene from Collateral with Tom Cruise and Jamie Foxx. So I'm just going to make it like a better structured version that's sort of taking cues from that instead of like ruining it for myself. So I find that to be super helpful, especially when I'm in the depths of like despair, because I've got a scene that's like hobbling on one leg and not working at all.
The thing I find most frustrating is, well, I care a lot about the soundtrack. I mean, the film music. As an academic, I worked on voiceover narration. I worked on dialogue. And the problem with books is there's no soundtrack. You know, you can't. So actually, I'm holding up the fourth one, because if the second one is really sort of a closet Western, the fourth one is a closet musical, but it doesn't have any music. And I kept, you know, saying, oh, well, the trumpets are playing or the lone flute, but it's not there. You just have to imagine it. So, yeah.
You could do like a soundtrack, like a side blog thing of like what music to listen to at what chapter.
Yeah, I know
like
people
that.
do Spotify lists and things like that.
Yeah,
I'm not that, you know, I'm that, whatever, organized.
Okay, there was a comment in the chat that I am going to assume was in relation to Brian saying he wasn't sure if his editor was watching. Christopher, who I'm not sure if he's your editor or someone else's, but saying we're always watching. Yeah. So just so you guys know, apparently your editors are always watching.
They are. You can't hide from your deadlines and from your editors.
Poor Brian.
Oh, I have to ask the COVID-related question. How has COVID affected your writing? Has it been harder to write because of everything going on and routines changing? Or has, especially being fantasy writer, fantasy and science fiction, has escaping from the real world kind of helped deal with everything going on?
Yeah, I think for me, my day-to-day routine didn't really change. I already worked from home and like never went out and did anything. So that part of it.
Saw anybody? No.
More or less. Like it took a while for like my introvertedness to finally be like, all right, I have to socialize with someone somehow. But I was like a month or two in before, like I'm gonna at least do like a Zoom call or something. I should like talk to someone, you know, besides my partner and my dog and all of that. So that side of things has been fine. I think that I benefited. I've been writing in a world that I've been in for a long time. So it's not so much that it's still a lot of work, but it's not like the raw kind of inspiration of like creating something from nothing. I think if that's the spot that I was in, I might have had some trouble. Just think it's hard to like fully have like the reins are off and there's just ways of creativity. I mean, I guess I'll find out pretty soon, since this is not really close to being over, and I'm gonna, you know, start working on something new in a bit here. But so it's been okay. And then at the same time, there have been days where there's just like too much bad news, and it seems like it's, you know, to go and kind of rewrite a scene of dialogue for the 15th time seems silly. But you know, by and large, it's been
okay. I've had a hard time, well, like many people with the pandemic, because I'm separated from people I care about much. In particular, I have one son in Colorado and one son in Europe, and I can't see either of them. And the sense of being cut off from people you love is not a great inducement to creative work. I mean, it's really pretty depressing. So, you know, I am counting the days to a vaccine for, you know, for everybody who's suffering from all sorts of loss.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't. It's the first year I've managed to take a holiday. you know, I got so bummed out after 4 months of complete lockdown that I managed to escape for 2 months. And I didn't do any work for 2 months. I ate a lot. I put on about 3 kilograms of, you know, with nice Spanish food. I went to the beach. I had drinks every night. It was hell. It was absolutely the worst thing that could happen. I couldn't get any work done whatsoever. And what I figured was I need to go back to England. I need a miserable, miserable winter. I need it to be cold. I need it to be dark. I need COVID. I need Brexit. I need everything to go wrong. And everything's been going great ever since. It's like, yeah, the world is suffering, but I'm getting so much work done. It's fantastic. It's like, all we need is, you know, Godzilla rising from the depths and maybe a meteorite strike, and I'll be on fire. And who knew that it doesn't help to be happy. It's better to be miserable. It's much more productive. So I recommend it. I highly recommend it. If you ever wanted to write a book, this is the year to do it.
Okay, don't wish meteorites on 2020 though. It's listening. The year is listening. We do not need meteorites.
Right.
Yeah, there's too many days left and too many more things to go wrong.
I like how we're all holding on to this like miraculous idea of 2021 though. Like January 1st is gonna come and we're all just like, when 2020's over, it's gonna be better, you guys.
We can
December
dream,
31st,
right?
2020 will be it.
What I'm hoping for is not like, just the year's over and the disaster stop, but the trajectory starts going up instead of down. Like now the bad news just keeps getting worse each day. And if we can just start getting slightly better, worse news, then I'm going to I feel like that's progress.
And less distracting, chaotic. Where you sort of feel like, oh, competent people are doing competent things. That then I don't have to check the news all the time. I could just write.
Yeah, it would be nice, but we'll see.
Whereas Lavie, on the other hand, is clearly hoping for more disasters.
Embracing the distraction.
Just had a helicopter go up here, so I mean, who knows what terrible things are coming. Better get on to writing quickly.
It was looking for you. It was looking for you because you've unleashed the dragon that's going to turn into a fish.
You know, when you're full time, I mean, you do just end up being at home anyway. I think the worst thing with the lockdown is that you're suddenly stuck at home with other people. Really, go out there. Leave me to be alone in my isolation chamber. I'm quite happy in my isolation chamber. Just don't break that. Yeah, no, it's challenging, but yeah, one day at a time.
Yeah, and for bookstores, bookstores need COVID to be over.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Because we can write all these books, but selling them during a pandemic and the problems with the printers and distribution is not good for us. Yeah.
Yes, the industry as a whole has been really interesting lately. In fact, we have a book coming out next month that the independent bookstore editions are coming from Germany, whereas the larger printing is being done in the US, but we're being told that we should expect ours first because US printing has been so affected. So the big chains are probably going to have later editions because they're being made in America. Mm-hmm. So there's been a lot of interesting things in the industry as a whole as a result of all of this. I know there's been a lot of delays for release dates for books later in the year. And so I know it's affecting you guys as authors too with what you're expecting.
I was in the middle of a book tour and my publicist called and said, come home. So, yeah.
Yeah, imagine it came to sort of a very abrupt stop.
One day I was on the door. The next day I was scampering for home. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We are so excited to have all your books in store, and I loved all of them so much. One of the things I've loved most about doing these panel events for these virtual is that it gives me an excuse to read a lot of books I would have read anyway at some point, but that as a bookseller, things get pushed back. You guys as authors probably also have the never-ending to be read pile. So I'm
Very
sure
true.
It's
No,
nice.
this has been great. Yeah, it's a lot of
It's
fun.
nice to meet you.
Yeah.
And
Nice
it's
meeting
really
all of
Nice to meet you.
fellow authors.
I will go back to my
Enjoy
first night out.
All right,
Nice,
thank you all.
have a seat.
Thank you, attendees.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.